We write our names in the skies.
There is fire in our eyes.
Dare to dream as we gaze upon the stars.
Every miner longs for eyes,
Like a burger needs its fries.
Friendship never dies, the world is ours.
flying without you is more than I can bear.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Push to Talk. We have a couple special guests this week. We have the general crew here. We've got Caleb and McLeod.
Hey guys.
What up?
We're missing RJ. RJ has the death flu apparently and is not able to join us for a second week in a row. So we miss him. Hope he feels better soon. We also have some special guests. We have Arendis here. Say hey, Arendis.
Hello, and McLeod, what the hell is on your head?
I can't explain it, to be completely honest.
I'll take the blame for this because he wore it when we were testing some video, and I said you need to wear that for the show. So for some reason,
literally looks like a dirty mop.
It is. We also are joined by the ever hilarious Moomin. Say hey, Moomin.
Hey, Moomin.
He is apparently here for comic relief. I didn't know that, but
well, you know, don't get your hopes up, as I mentioned earlier on.
We are also joined by two authors of a very interesting paper that is out there, and that is titled. And we'll link it in the chat. It is titled "Barbarians at the Imperium Gates: Organizational Culture and Change in EVE Online." And Caleb brought this up to us earlier in the week, and I took a read on it. And man, it is a really interesting look at some of the stuff within virtual worlds. So it's pretty cool. So I'll introduce them. Dr. Nick is one of the authors. Say hey, Dr. Nick.
Hello, everyone.
And we've got Lord Scar.
Greetings.
They said this wasn't a very serious paper, so we're going to treat it with extreme seriousness, of course.
Yeah, damn right.
And thank you for linking that, Caleb, in the chat. And hello to everybody out there in the chat. Saw a couple people as we were ramping up the show that said hello. So how you doing, guys? As always, if you enjoy the show, shoot us a follow, or anything else. Subscriptions to INN to support all the streamers here would be great. All right, who wants to start? Caleb, why don't I let you start with talking about this paper because you brought it to our attention.
Well, it was linked to me by the missus, so I read through it and I found it extremely interesting. And the whole project that the journal comes out of is really cool. I haven't been able to catch up on all the back issues, but apparently it goes all the way back to, correct me if I'm wrong, Nick. 2008 is when you guys started doing the journal, right?
So we've written pieces in a number of different places, but we've been working on and around EVE for the last several years. Probably Oscar longer than me, because Oscar did his PhD focused around it.
Yeah, I started roughly in 2006, just writing about EVE. But if you mean the journal specifically, this was a special editorial about Eve. It's sponsored by, or not sponsored, but led by Marcus Carter and Kenny Bergstrom, who do a lot of work on Eve as well. And they got a bunch of us to kind of work on this particular issue.
So how did you decide to write this paper? What was kind of the reason what you wanted to show? Because I know a lot of the audience hasn't read it at all, so maybe a little brief summary would be great.
So, having talked to each other at conferences and so on, and we'd done a bit of co-writing together in another piece, which was about the idea that the Eve is real phrase, and Marcus and Kelly, who we've mentioned, have also written various pieces around Eve, and we've been talking together about a number of things. And Oscar and I realised that we had a kind of crossover of interests. Oscar's, well, I mean, as he'll tell you, I don't doubt he's very interested in kind of the organisational cultural side of things. I'm a historian by background, and I'm really interested in the way in which Eve shows us interesting things about history, and that kind of came together in quite a good way to think about how different organisations in Eve think about their past, and for Oscar, how they change, and how those two things work together.
So I'll just give a really quick kind of intro for the paper just to make sure that people know what we're talking about. It's a paper that looks at specifically the name change of the Clusterfuck Alliance to the Imperium, and then kind of the social backlash that you could argue had occurred because of the name change. And I compared that to the time when Test entered the Honey Badger Alliance and the cultural backlash within the organization that kind of ended up causing the death of Test temporarily anyway, as they went to small PvP until they finally came back.
I think a question that I have for the paper is: do you still stand by the arguments you make, and do you still think that do you think it was an actual positive choice to get away from that naming convention? And then do you have an explanation for why you kind of ended it exactly where you did? Because it does slightly read as a journal that lacks the final chapter or the last act.
So that last comment is fair. We basically finished the paper exactly where we were as far as chronological history. I do realize that there were some changes in Eve that happened after this, but the moment that we actually submitted the paper for publication, and you have to realize publications take about 9 months or so, so that's why we're a little behind. But we submitted the paper just about the time when Imperium basically shut down and lost most of its outside territories.
And I think that, I mean, when we wrote it originally, because we originally wrote it as a conference paper, and the first version of the paper ended just at the point when the Kickstarter had been unsuccessful, but the general process of changing to the Imperium seemed to have been really successful. So, even our views have changed between that one paper and then the presentation in the journal. And as you say, then they continue to change as events unfold.
But to your first question, insofar as do we stand by it, personally, I still do. I'm talking about the strength of organizational cultures for groups in EVE Online, and I think it's really true. Regardless of what organization you're going to look at, the culture is basically what defines operational standards for a group.
So when you actually talk about culture, though, in what kind of terms are you actually describing or defining a culture in its own right? Because obviously, it's like, different people might actually kind of interpret that phrase slightly differently. So how would you guys define it in this particular context?
Do you want to take this one, Nick?
Sure, I can do. I mean, generally speaking, when we're thinking about culture here, we're thinking about a set of common practices, a set of commonly understood standards and ways of being and behaving. So if you think about organizational culture in these terms within EVE, you'll think about, the examples that Oscar used in terms of test with things like fleet porn and things like that. So just practices that take place within those organizations and groups that are part of the norms for that group, and you might consider to be distinctive in some ways of that group as well.
Okay, so it's very much those kind of, to kind of like use an analogy, I guess, realistically, is if you were to take something like, football fans, that kind of like tribalism, the colours that they wear, the chants that they actually use, that type of stuff would define a culture in the same context for like EVE Online corporations, alliances. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think we think about those things in the same kinds of way. I mean, academically, we certainly would, and the ways in which people subscribe to and engage with those ideas are all part of what build up their cultural identities.
Okay, so with the abstract of the actual paper, when you kind of like start off, what was the criteria for actually selecting the organisations that you did? Was it ones that you'd felt had some sort of like a cultural change within them, or what were the mechanisms for actually talking about? You spoke about the Imperium test and also Brave as well. So, what was the reasoning behind that?
I might let Nick take the question about the Imperium, but as far as test and Brave, it was a more of a methodological region, let's say a practical reason, and that is I did my research, and while I was doing my research, I was in test at the time when it joined with Brave to form the Honey Badger coalition. So you can imagine that that's basically a large set of data, a lot of valuable cultural discussions, and I managed to use them for this paper as well.
Right. So because of your kind of your actual experience with those particular organisations, they were obviously a good choice for you to go for, because you had some inside knowledge of them. So with regards to the selection of the Imperium, then Nick, what made you kind of like go for them?
Well, the thing that really interests me about EVE, as I say, I'm a historian, and the historical activity that goes on around EVE, things like True Stories, for example, and Andrew Groan's book, have been the things that have really attracted me to the game community. And the sort of way in for me on this was that Fountain War book and the Kickstarter around that. And because my background is actually in medieval history, I was immediately struck by the way in which it resembled the kinds of historical writing projects that went on in the medieval period as rulers sought to consolidate their power base.
Okay, so it almost sounds as if you're alluding to practices that are available in something like The Prince, where obviously if you have a change of power within a particular organisation or region, is where they will actually take certain actions in order to reaffirm or affirm their like power base. Is that kind of like true?
Yeah, I think you're completely right. And the Prince obviously comes out of a more developed economic and political context than the historical writing that I was thinking about. Just because I was thinking about, a period probably about 500-600 years before the Prince was written. But it is the same kind of processes, and it comes from the same place, which is how do we create a structure that underpins what we're trying to do? How do we make this make sense? And if we're making a change, how do we argue that that change isn't really the big change it might feel like? There's something of the always the sameness about it.
Okay, so it also in that abstract, when you actually open up, you seem to infer that this was about a kind of very rudimentary like structure. So the political structure that would actually be like created for people to actually group together, to band together for whatever kind of like purpose. Do you feel that that could be construed as a bit of a misnomer, given the fact that everyone that actually participates in EVE is generally from, a very kind of mature political system, realistically, in the real world? So why wouldn't they necessarily emulate that rather than actually go back to something that might be considered a more primitive political system.
Do you want to come in, Oscar, or shall I take that?
Yeah, I might take this one. So the difference here would be between operationalizing a particular perspective and then presenting a specific culture. So if you think about the Imperium specifically, how the visuals and the language about the organization changed abruptly with the name, right? It's not a change necessarily in the political system, although that did change afterwards, but I would say that changed because of the economics of the game rather than anything else. But the imagery changed from being very cartoony to being very formal. The discussions, the language used became Roman specifically. And this is purposeful incorporation of a particular stance, in my view anyway. And yeah, we could incorporate, capitalist ideals. We could incorporate these other ideals as well, but they weren't necessarily relevant to the discussions that people were having in game.
I think the other...
Sorry, please go for it.
I was just going to say, I think the other part of that picture is that in the contemporary world, we don't see a lot of new state formation. We don't see a lot of territorialist empire building in a way that we might have done. I mean, we saw a lot of that in the medieval period, but actually in contemporary society, there isn't that many. There aren't that many situations where somebody goes and conquers an area of space, whereas of course in Eve that happens a lot. And so we can look at models where borders and policies are a bit more fluid. And I think that's why reaching back to those sort of earlier models is helpful here.
Yeah, sorry, it's like Horrendous is like apparently I'm talking too much.
Well,
so over to you, Horrendous motherfucker.
Part of what's going on, and thank you for injecting that bit of profanity there, Moom. The chat says we're being serious. Is that as we've established, you guys can't see the chat, so we need to relay stuff to you. And a question had come up in the Twitch chat. Sheriff asked, the paper seems to focus a lot on external perception of the Imperium. How visible were internal sentiments within the Imperium to you?
Most of what we did around the Imperium, certainly from my view, was around the material that was being posted on places like TMC, also on EN24, looking at Reddit commentary. We didn't directly interview Imperium players. That wasn't the way we approached this. We approached it in a much more kind of, I suppose, documentary fashion in terms of looking at, in inverted commas, published documents. But I think there was a sense of, certainly we were getting the stronger voices in the Imperium coming through. So we saw stuff by Sean Kumitoto, for example. Is that right? Kumitomo. Cyan. Sorry, my bad. And other people writing for TMC. So straight away there, we were getting some voices which were bringing out an Imperium view. I think Oscar had something to add as well.
Yeah, I was just going to. Sorry, I'm just going to drop in one more thing, and that's as far as internal voices. I spent a long time recording and kind of analyzing the different speeches by leaders in both test and the State of the Union and all these kind of things. So I had a lot of the official stances for leaders, but a little less access to the inner Goon forums. So you can take that for whether I'm hearing the inside voice or not.
So you guys basically got a lot of our outward-facing presentations. And I think that informs a lot of what's going on in the piece, because there are very different narratives that were going on through all of this, internally and externally. Internally, one of the things to keep in mind is that the biggest thing we never do is take ourselves seriously, including about whether or not we're taking ourselves seriously.
I did get the distinct impression when I was reading the article that, it did seem very much like you were taking the very much more public facing kind of comments and direction of conversation, from the side of Imperium. But I would like to. I would say that, like, as much as Scion is, you know, a very learned person and extremely good when it comes to, you know, cross alliance and cross coalition kind of diplomacy, like one-on-one sort of thing and that kind of thing. Every time I read like one of Sion's INN posts, it was so cringy for me. I don't know why. It always made me feel like oh, this is like the worst of the worst
There's a reason
like
for that, actually.
trying to trigger people. It felt like it felt like every post that he made was a trigger post to try and trigger people more.
It was.
Yeah.
Like legit, Sion is one of those guys who likes to start fires. That's why he's a diplomat. He gets to start fires and then piss on them. Or was a diplomat, because he's not doing that anymore.
Yeah. I mean, he was very, very good at, you know, pulling the strings behind the scenes kind of thing, but I don't know. When it comes to actually getting the true measure of how Imperium kind of felt at the time, like looking at Sion's post on INN was probably not the best way of knowing exactly how we felt.
No.
And one of the other things to keep in mind, and this is something that Lemba had pointed out internally when we started assembling the idea for it, the Viceroy program. Both Sion's posts and the Viceroy program were actually intended to see how far we could push everybody and how far we could piss everybody off. They just happened to succeed far more than we anticipated.
That's saying something.
So I just wanted to give a quick comment. I mean, your point is very valid. And, you know, that's just the limit of our levels of access, right? I mean, there's only so much I can see of internal communications, but I did want to let the readers of the paper know what internal communications can do in culture, which is why I tested them in the paper, right? If you think about it, if I could have, I would have been able to just do the whole paper through the Imperium and through Goons. But I wanted to let people know that there was an internal discussion, a different set of ways of operating, and that the reader hopefully will be able to extrapolate that there is something more complicated than just the outgoing messages, but the outgoing messages are very important as well.
And that's,
yes, they are.
Yeah, one of the things that I found, you know, intriguing about the papers, you could tell that you didn't have a lot of insight inside the Imperium. And what's interesting to me is to see how that's perceived from the outside, right? I mean, that's what was fascinating to me.
One of the things actually I kind of wanted to ask was, at that particular point, was Andrew Groen's book something that you could, you know, reference back for, you know, for context of various different things in here? Because I did kind of feel like it to some degree in the article that, like, understanding the Imperium, also you kind of have to understand the roots of the CFC and the roots of where Goons came from in terms of fashioning a narrative, because Goons really fashioned the narrative of being belittled by the largest group in EVE and turning that around and going, well, if you're going to brandish us as the bad guy, then we will play the bad guy to the fullest extent that we can.
I mean, yeah, I've got Andrew Groen's book on my desk next to me here. And that was, you know, I mean, that has always been part of the, I suppose, the historical backdrop for me. I mean, I suppose the comment I just make about the lack of internal access is that certainly, again, kind of as a medievalist, most of what you're doing is piecing a history together from the traces people have left behind. You know, everyone's been dead for 1,000 years. You can't talk to them. And so I suppose I approached it in a similar kind of way. But you're right, you end up with quite a limited perspective. But I don't think necessarily that makes the conclusions that we took away less valid, because I think the things that we pointed to, whether or not they were about annoying other people or whether they were kind of intended in seriousness, do resemble those historical processes. And I think that kind of says something interesting and important just about the way people think about the way they do things and the way that the things that we have done as a species, in effect, kind of roll around and come around again.
Just out of curiosity, will you guys be considering writing a follow-up? Because as I pointed out earlier, it did feel a lot like you finished it before the last act was actually out, right? So it's historically at a point in time where all of these things that you write is fundamentally true. It's just that the whole process and the conclusion seems to be missing, right? Because with the things that Arenda says about not taking themselves seriously in Goons, and the whole cultural revolution and the changes that were being pushed out there, you only seem to cover the fallout or the flag, where the point that they're at now is kind of what we would want in an art, in a journal, right?
So I can't say anything for Nick. I think we do wish to continue writing for different things, but one problem that I kind of have to point out is we have to write academic papers, which means we have to talk about something greater than just the individual case. And it would be hard to be able to give the end of this story at this point without being able to bring in something very, very new as far as our understandings of how cultures are spread and our understanding of how territory is controlled, for instance. So we're going to try, and who knows, maybe we'll write an actual news article. That would be fast. But as far as a paper, I'd let Nick answer that one now.
I mean, we've talked already that we want to do at least one more piece anyway. Just thinking about you mentioned Moomin mentioned more contemporary forms of political approach, and we thought about looking at something which brought together ideas around feudalism, which is really what we kind of are arguing is going on here with the idea, that Eve is supposed to be this space of unfettered capitalism, and how do we reconcile those kind of ideas when they're kind of fundamentally separated historically. But whether or not that would answer or end the story in the way that would be ideal, I don't know. I mean, one of the things that historians tend to say is they like to get critical distance before they write about anything, but normally that means that, you're talking 50 years down the line. And we probably don't want to leave it that long, because I think the other thing is, anyway, things in Eve change. Eve moves much more quickly than contemporary society does in terms of the way in which events impact on decisions that get made in Eve and so on. So I don't think we need to leave it quite so long. But Oscar's ultimately right. We would need to find a way in that would allow us to continue to develop this discussion. But I think Eve will give us that anyway, just in the way in which it continues to change and move on. I mean, the introduction of Citadels, for example, has changed a bunch of stuff about the way people are playing the game, and there's a lot of kind of concern about that. And that could, that change could provide the frame to do a new piece, for example.
So when exactly did you finish this kind of piece? What was the kind of date, and where were, say, for instance, like the Imperium at that particular point?
Like you said, wasn't it like right at the end where everyone was basically bunched up in low sec?
Had we made the move down to Delve or not by then?
I think you were just at the point where you were going to, and you hadn't quite.
Okay, so the other bit that kind of I found quite interesting from a history perspective as well was even just like the names that you actually use for the casino war, as we like to call it. The reason being is when we actually kind of started off on this particular one, we were referring to it as the War of Selfless Aggression, whereas CCP very kind of inspiringly called it the Easter War, because they have a serious lack of imagination when it comes to these things. Meanwhile, obviously, those against us were calling it World War B, which is a great name. I will kind of must kind of stress that. But the one that we actually settled on in the end was the one coined by Noisy Gamer, which was the Casino War, because that described best the mechanism for how this war had come about, and equally some of the driving force behind it all as well. So why did you settle on the names that you did, and how come you actually missed those other ones?
All right, I guess I'll have to take this one. So a lot of it, first of all, the Casino War wasn't a name that was tossed around when we were developing the research and talking about this particular paper. I did hear the term the War of Solveless Aggression. However, since we're trying to write for a non-Eve audience, the War of Solveless Aggression would require us to actually explain the concepts of Sov and why this wouldn't be Sov, even though territory was being lost, which would have made it a lot more complicated for me. And World War B is very catchy. So I guess you could say it's a bit of a lazy thing on my part.
If we're honest about it, because at no point, you know, World War B, what? Bees fighting each other? That's madness, sir.
Yeah, so a lot of it is kind of practical purposes as far as that's concerned.
I mean, to be completely honest, like, yeah, fair enough. The Imperium did have a different name for the war at the time. It was a very accurate name for the war, but it wasn't in any way emotive, in the same way that World War B was. Like, the Casino War is a little bit better in terms of like a, well-rounded thing, and the fact that it actually came from someone who wasn't actually Imperium was pretty good. The fact, a very good kind of, neutral starting point for the actual, name of the conflict.
Yeah, they definitely.
But it's just one of those things. Yeah, true. But but then again, when you're coming from a kind of direction that most people who may not actually know too much about Eve, the term World War B probably would be the more utilized.
It gives you it gives you the impression of this is a grand conflict.
Mm.
Yeah, is this where I interject? World War in a space game across solar systems makes no sense. Okay,
well,
I said it.
What were we going to call it? Mittens versus Lady Scarlet, round 63. I mean,
it was it was the universe versus Goonswarm, or the Imperium.
well, that was part of the narrative going on, is they wanted to make it all about us, but they wanted to make it all about, everybody was attacking Goonswarm, but Goonswarm was the ones that were really, in a way, least hurt by it. We lost space. Space is nothing. Space is just where you're doing your stuff. You can go and do your stuff wherever.
Yeah, but I think the general perception in the game from general players is when you lose your space, it hurts, right?
Well, sure, but that's because of how people typically lose their space. I mean, people typically lose their space by doing this. There's a big war, there's all these fights, and the line members lose all their stuff, and that really wasn't what happened here, because we kind of saw it coming and had people get their stuff out if they could. And as this is actually one of the things that caught my eye in the article. You at one point you guys referenced something where a line member in one of the Imperium alliances is talking about how the leadership is doing all this and they've got buffers, but the line members don't. I don't know which alliance that person was part of. It's not listed in the article, and that may easily be because by the time you guys got around to writing, it was impossible to track it down. I'm not slamming anybody on that, but I know, at least within Goons, generally speaking, our line members didn't really have any sort of economic bleed at all. The ship replacement program paid for their losses. The alliance itself was kind of running on fumes economically by the time we finished the fight, but the entire idea and why we just ceded the space without fighting for it was that there was no way to win this war, and we weren't going to throw our members' stuff away uselessly.
Yeah, as mostly a line member at that time, and actually, our organization was part of the Imperium CFC. I wasn't Goonswarm proper. It was very clear what the tactic was inside without it being explained. You can't defend the space under the current SOB system. You got to just let it go, save what you can, regroup, and go somewhere else. And you're not going to go somewhere else until the fervor of the rest of the game calms down and they don't want to chase you. That was my impression during the whole experience.
Yeah.
Isn't that also a challenge when writing things like scientific papers, what to include and exclude when it comes to the dependency or the variables from CCP?
Oh, absolutely.
I'm
not knocking the paper,
right? If they and if you guys already said you didn't have access to a lot of internal viewpoints from the Imperium, so there's really very little way you could have known that was not a general sentiment.
Yeah, and I think when you're writing something like this, you're putting some of these things in to get a sense of the flavour of the debate that you're seeing in the public space. And that, as you say, if we don't have internal access, then we don't necessarily know what's going on behind closed doors. But we can see comments coming through, and if somebody says something like that, you tend to go, well, okay, well, we should take that seriously. It might be a thing, it might not be a thing. We won't make a big deal of it. We'll just put it in there as some further material that gives some more context to this discussion.
I kind of want to ask a question as to where, in terms of the whole, whether you had internal or like external kind of referencing for what was going on with Imperium at that time. But like, when you were writing up there, or like, drafting the paper, setting it out, was there discussions about whether you should actually get an internal viewpoint of Imperium at the time? Or was that considered like, oh, if you were to try and develop something like that, or maybe even advertise to get someone's internal view of that it may have been played as a propaganda kind of piece, or played in a sense of like being able to funnel propaganda through to you in that sort of sense? Or like, how did you feel about sort of trying to balance the perspectives?
I mean, I didn't have any worries about propaganda in that respect. I suppose more it's about the resources that we have to throw at this and the amount of time that we have to do those kinds of activities. And ultimately, you're doing this in a kind of a limited space of time to hit deadlines, much like anything else. And so we each took the approaches from the research experience and expertise and information we already had to some extent. So I was working with, as I say, a bunch of publicly available documents. Oscar was drawing on his ethnographic work that he'd done already, and then building on that with some more contemporary material. With more time, with more resources, and I think absolutely we would have gone and talked to a lot more people. But this is what we were able to accomplish within the resource envelope we had, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the research goes, I mean, I really enjoyed the paper. I mean, it was interesting seeing the different perspective, and I think that's one of the most important things to take away before you read this.
Well, I am glad that you enjoyed the paper. I just wanted to say that it's actually, Eve is a very cautious space. So even if you're trying to enter in to a group to get information without an in, people usually don't take you very seriously, or if they do, they treat you seriously as a spy. So granted, for this particular paper, I didn't try to get internal goon comms, but actually I did prior, and I managed to, I guess, badly spy my way into a couple meetings, but mostly goons actually were very good about blocking any research attempts.
One of the things, I know we're talking specifically on the paper and some of the things related to Eve, but one of the more interesting things is the site that it comes from too, right? I mean, this is research into virtual worlds, virtual societies, right? And how serious is that really taken in the area of research? To be perfectly honest, I'm interested in that from you too.
Yeah, in academia.
So I think it depends what discipline you're in. I think in traditional history, not very. But I'm in the process at the moment of working on a book to specifically engage with the challenges that virtual worlds present to us as historians, because I think there's a bunch of things about the ways in which things occur in virtual worlds that we need to take much more seriously. And I mean, Eve is a great example of this, but you can see other examples in places like Second Life, even in things like EverQuest, where players are taking historical material about the game, about their own experiences in games, like far more seriously than I think a lot of academics give give credit for. And particularly, I think the thing that's important is that we have an idea of historical writing, which is grounded in an understanding really of how the world worked, which sort of runs from about 1700 to about 2000. So this sort of period of time when we've built this sort of rational structure about how we interrogate the past, for example, how we understand the past. And I'm not sure that holds together when so much of our experience is now virtualized.
Aren't you also slightly handicapped by, I don't know if this is entirely fair, but having a sample size of one, right? There's not really any of the other virtual worlds that's caught up with the seriousness or the depth of something like Eve, right?
Well, actually, I would say there's actually a lot of. It's a very growing field. This study of virtual worlds, of gaming cultures, these things. It's not quite, I'd say, fully operational as far as being an academic field, but it's growing and it's gaining interest. And communications is very big on studying it now. But to answer your other question, there's actually quite a lot of games that you could learn from. So Second Life was used as an example for a lot of books and research. And also, you have to remember that these players, a lot of them jump from game to game. So there's a really good study that you can get from people that, a game is dying and they're moving to, let's say, World of Warcraft, and they all move together as a particular group. How is the group going to change when game, for instance?
Yeah, but I meant like things like other games don't really have, well, maybe Second Life, but to be honest, no other game seems to have the historicity to actually create any historical argument, right? There is no history in a World of Warcraft-like scenario, and since most other games are split shards, you can't really even comment on sociology or community building and stuff like that because it's naturally split, right? Similarly, with things like finance, and you can't really write a serious academic article about economies that are not built by the player base and dominated by the developer. So that's what I meant when I said there's only really a sample size of one, as far as I can tell.
I don't know if that's actually true there. Caleb.
Yeah, if I can jump in here, I mean, you might have a point about the economics research, although I actually find that, for instance, Guild Wars 2 has a very good, it's the entire world. There's not a server-based economy, so you can get some readings out of that. But
I was deliberately exaggerating. I know that you can work around it. I'm just pointing out that until we see more games try to develop into the same area of EVE Online, you guys are a little bit handicapped if you want to write really serious articles about games, right?
I mean, just to kind of back up what Oscar's saying, I think there's you're right in essence, Caleb, right? You've got this one very, very rich environment and very rich community, and that's EVE, and it's definitely the standout example. But I think if you look at, looking at the historical stuff like I am, EVE provides a particular kind of historical activity or a particular kind of past, and players have a particular kind of historical engagement, and it then becomes interesting to see what kind of engagements they've got in other games. So if you look at EverQuest, there's a lot of engagement around a kind of what we consider sort of the space of memory. Memory studies or space of memory. So people talk, there's a lot of reminiscing about EverQuest, which is it's quite an important process in historical work, particularly when you're thinking about public history, about if you look at local history, for example, writing on local history is very, very strongly associated with these kind of memory processes and this memorialization. So you sort of see different things going on, and that's what makes the whole spectrum interesting. But you're right that EVE does some very distinctive things of its own.
Yeah, especially because most other games that come to mind, they don't really have this meta layer of coverage and article writing and basically being the historians firsthand, right? There is none of that in other games, whereas if you were doing historical studies of EVE, you could actually go back physically to forum posts and articles and stuff like that all the way back to 2003 and 4, right? but you don't really have something similar in any other game. Right now, we've moved into video production when it comes to media and stuff like that, and that whole process has not really been mirrored in any other gaming society or community, right?
I'm not sure that's really true, Caleb. There's a lot of articles, and it's less now because it's not quite as much of a singular cultural thing. But when especially around like Burning Crusade to Lich King, WoW had a fairly active, shall we say, historical record of what's going on in the game, who's doing what, as far as notable individuals and what sort of thing they were doing, just in coverage, places like WoW Insider and such. So there is a level of that, but it's not the same.
Yeah, I was actually going to use WoW as an example as well, because you have the competition, for instance, a worldwide competition for who kills a boss first, right? And so you have this entire meta narrative that is followed, and people talk about, oh, these guys, they got screwed out of the first spot last time. Let's see how they do this time. That's all you could argue historical record, right? And I think that allows you to look at other games. And granted, WoW is a really big one, right? But as long as the community wants to record things, they will, and then you have something that you can use.
And I think that's it. It's the importance to the community that's the key here. The extent to which it matters, and the reason that history is important is that it matters to people, and that engagement with the past and that focus on those important things is really strong in Eve, because it conditions a lot of what people do and a lot of the way that people build arguments for doing particular things. You can see the constant callbacks to things like the Bob Affair, for example, or to some of the larger battles as sort of touchstones to describe what's going on at the moment. And I wrote a piece last year, well, it was published last year, about the journalism in Eve, for example, and that was, again, kind of part of that picture. And we have this idea in history that journalism is the first draft of history, and Eve has journalism in a way that other games just don't really.
Did you read any of my pieces?
I understand you and Seraph Basarab weren't the best of friends. I kind of got that impression.
Oh well,
that is the overarching thing.
I think he was kind of flirting with me to some degree. I mean, he wrote a number of pieces about me, and I think he kind of closed off with trying to make a point that apparently I'm an autistic, racist homophobe, which was quite interesting coming from Seraph.
Coming from the man who regularly quotes Goebbels, yeah.
He's an interesting fellow, I have to say. But I did want to actually quickly ask a question that was sent to us from Dirk, in actual fact, to Dr. Nick and Scar, actually, as well. In your researching and in sort of obviously the with relation to the journal, is there actually a virtual world out there that kind of compares to Eve across all of its various dimensions and complexities? Like, have you found one that rivals or even eclipses?
Well, I'll answer first then. No. Some people try to. There was that attempt with, what was it, Britannia, something. But I would say that just absolutely nothing has come to the level of engagement that Eve has, as far as developing cultures, developing economies, developing territorial systems of control. All these things are pretty unique to the context.
And I'd echo that. I mean, Eve is particularly distinctive. I think there are other worlds which have, elements of what they do that's kind of interesting. I mean, if, there are places where, for example, you can see things like legal systems emerging, which are perhaps more developed than Eve. A Tale in the Desert, for example, tried something which was quite interesting. But there's no way that pulls together as many things as Eve. And again, from a historian's viewpoint, that kind of attention to the past in Eve is just far more developed. And I think the fact that CCP have tended to support it has also been quite important, although I am really sad that True Stories site disappeared and that, the Eve Wiki went away as well.
The Eve wiki is actually largely mirrored at Backstage. I'll find the link for that somewhere.
Oh, brilliant! That'd be great. I hadn't realised that.
I think Dark's question there is kind of relevant. Do you think we can even call Eve Online an actual game anymore?
Well, that's the discussion that came around in Second Life, right? I would argue, yes, game can be anything that requires engagement, and I definitely needs engagement for Eve Online. So yes.
Well, and the other kind of thing is like, I mean, you know, when you look at how people kind of take Eve so seriously, you know, with the old adage of internet spaceships is serious business. You know, you also have that phrase as well of, you know, life is a game. Go play it.
Yeah, absolutely, and you know, I think the thing that people take seriously. I mean, yes, okay, they take the game seriously, but they also take their social relations with other human beings seriously, and I think that's quite a lot of what goes on in multiplayer games. Is people are thinking seriously about the way they relate to others. So, can you think? You know, is Eve still a game? I mean, yes, in its kind of most limited terms, it's a game, but I think as soon as you push into some of the meta, a lot of what's going on is simply people behaving as part of a community, and the fact that it is with reference to a game is interesting, but I don't necessarily know that we have to consider that in ludic terms. We can consider it in more social and political terms, perhaps.
I would say that Eve is a game where you actually create your own end boss, and the stories that we actually create for ourselves within Eve far exceed those that are actually produced by other games and kind of spoon-fed to us. And I think that's relatively kind of like evident when you actually look at the news pieces that come from Eve relatively regularly with some of the stuff that we actually do. It seems to have an impact on the kind of modern media that no other game does, and it has done so consistently for well over a decade.
Yeah, and I don't think I'm not aware of another game where so many of the players describe their process of play as creating content.
Mario Maker.
So when we look at social constructs that occur in games and the cultures that are developed, what I think is going to be interesting over time, and probably one of the more interesting things to study from an academic perspective, is how does the interaction in the game, the exposure that people get being in these different groups that are tremendously more diverse than they get in their normal everyday life, how does that affect culture over time? I think that's going to be insanely interesting. I don't know what you guys think about that, but you know, if you need me to explain it further, I will.
You're absolutely right, and it's actually there's another journal, right, Gaming and Culture, that, for instance, looks at this particular discussion as well.
Yeah, I mean, it is fascinating. It's the really distinctive thing that I think is worth studying. You know, I mean, I want to, as a historian, I want to know what the history of today looks like from 20 years in the future. Because if we think about the amount of time, for example, we spend sat at computers, playing games, being involved in virtual activity, you know, what are historians going to write down? I mean, this is why I think virtual worlds challenge how we deal with history, because we're not just going to, you know, write that we all sat down and tapped keyboards. We're going to have to engage with the experiences that we are having and what those things mean, and that's a fundamental change in our cultural disposition towards the past.
Well, it's even more of a fundamental change than that. I mean, if you look at if you think about it, in 500 years, what are the archaeologists going to be able to dig up about this time? We leave no letters behind. We send everything through email. What exactly, what correspondence are they going to find?
Absolutely, and there's a lot of debates in the archiving space at the moment about what we should archive and what we should keep, because there's a point of view that we can keep everything, and so we should. But, you know, as a historian, I know what it's like when you've got information overload and you just can't find anything because you've got so much stuff. So there's a balance there as well between our kind of capacity to keep everything in a format which is quite ephemeral and as you say, doesn't have the durability of paper, for example, or manuscripts, which we've had for thousands of years, against this sort of other situation where we keep fewer things in different formats. It's hard to know.
Yeah, I think that it was estimated that up until about the year 2000, there had been 5 petabytes worth of data created by man. And since then, every year we do something like about 3 petabytes of data every single year subsequently. So, I mean, it's quite interesting, that sort of thing. And just imagine how much shit there actually is there as well. Does anyone remember the Harlem Drop kind of little video thing? It was about 30 seconds playing some music, and then kind of the drop came in, and then they kind of ended up dancing in strange costumes and stuff. Do you remember that?
I don't know. I'm just imagining somebody digging up cuneiform Twitter.
Well, I only mentioned that one because at its height, it was 30 seconds long, and every day on YouTube, 36 hours worth of these things was being uploaded every single day. It was impossible to actually just watch just that in that single day. Not that I could think that anyone would want to.
And it would be really, really difficult to actually understand why, all of this suddenly appeared out of nowhere without actually having some kind of, some kind of media to explain it at least a little bit,
I think they're going to be archaeologists watching this show 200 years from now, and they're going to say, "Why the fuck is McLeod wearing that getup?" I think that's what's going to happen.
Who the hell knows?
And by the way, that was for the people who said we're not swearing enough on the show. So there you go.
I think they'll accord his wig some deep religious significance.
I think so.
It will be some kind of weird. No, it really won't. It really will not.
Isn't that always the fallback for historians and archaeologists when they don't know? It's a ritualistic, mystical thing.
It's kind of going for a pastafarian look, isn't he?
I thought it. I thought the kind of grayness kind of almost sort of felt a bit sort of Asian-y. I don't know why.
Yeah, with that red beard, you're all Asian. Let me tell you, buddy.
Yeah, fuck you, man.
And by the way, this is one of those things, right?
Interrupting. I just wanted to say I actually have to drop out, and I wanted to thank you guys for having us and for talking about the paper. And I hope you guys have the good end of the stream.
Thanks, and we really appreciate.
Thank you very much.
Time to join us.
All right, have a good day.
You too, bud.
So when I started talking about the impact of these type of social interactions on our future culture, right? I mean, how many people do you know in your regular life that talk to people from other countries on a regular basis? I think it just doesn't happen, but for us, it's extremely common, right?
And I think it's one of the sad things about region locking servers is that it's reduced that as well in shard orientated games. As speaking as somebody who was playing EverQuest from the start, we were playing on American servers with people from all over the world, and then playing WoW later, we weren't suddenly.
Well, I think one of the nice things about Eve is the fact that being halfway around the world doesn't massively affect your performance in the game too much. And in that kind of sense, I did kind of want to touch on some kind of cultural and sort of social aspects of, all of the different organizations and groups in Eve as being kind of almost catalysts to break down nationalist and ethnic kind of barriers as well. Because there's a lot of games where you end up socializing in groups that are kind of nearish to you almost geographically because of the fact that you can't play with people from the other side of the world because of the way that the games or the ways that you interact prevent it from a performance standpoint.
It's similar to the effect that the modern trains did to genetics, right? Suddenly, people had the ability to actually marry a lot farther from home than they had been able to in the past. So, as that, the internet and this gaming culture is on par with some of those developments in the past. It's the same with how letter writing suddenly exploded when literacy exploded. So these things are just a next tier in the human development, right? It's just that it's so extreme compared to things that happened in the past.
Caleb's getting deep.
but
It's true.
He's getting deep, but he's kind of right, yeah.
It's also getting. It's also being pushed a little bit more into the mainstream kind of the media spotlight as well, with films like Ready Player One sort of coming, soon to be coming onto the mainstream. That because in a sense that's also dealing with virtual worlds and a mixing of multiple cultures.
Absolutely, and made here in Birmingham, where which they used as the setting for the the sort of blighted future, which probably says something about where I live.
I must say
says it was
that
cheaper than Jersey.
very well done for concealing your Brummie accent as well as you have.
I didn't grow up here.
Yeah,
I shall resist. I shall resist.
Got to say thank God.
No, I love Birmingham. It's great. I just don't have a local accent.
What would be a local Birmingham accent? I have no clue, right? Because America. I don't know.
McLeod
if you
can
want,
obviously do a copy.
I'm really bad at accents, but if you want a classic Birmingham accent, like go watch things
Ozzy
like
Osbourne.
like Ozzy Osbourne has a classic, very much so. Ozzy Osbourne has the classic kind of Birmingham accent, Birmingham accent. That's kind of like what it is. Other things, if you have watched or kind of want to watch, which I would recommend, Peaky Blinders. It also has a bunch of Birmingham accents.
It has a bunch of people doing kind of bad Birmingham accents. There's a lot. There was a lot of upset in Birmingham about people not doing good Birmingham accents. But...
If you consider the accent on that to actually be good, then you probably really like Dick Van Dyke's Cockney rendition as well.
I would. They are probably better Birmingham accents than most Americans can do Birmingham accents.
Yeah. If the other place you can look is if you can find it on YouTube. There's an old soap opera called Crossroads, which was made in Birmingham and has a number of Brummie characters.
Also, Blazing Serpent says, I think Guy Martin's from Birmingham. Was all right. He has a bit of a Birmingham accent, or is that me? I'm not thinking right.
Not sure.
So I'm going to give a shout out here to Esco Krividas because he did sub earlier and we didn't mention it because the conversation has been so riveting. So yeah, I want to give a shout out to him. Thank you very much for that sub.
So, given that you're actually trying to make your studies with regards to the kind of like the gaming side of things taken more seriously, is there anything that you would like to see from the EVE community as a whole in order to actually like foster that?
Well, to be honest, I think this is a great example of really valuable things for us as academics, because it makes you feel like someone is paying attention to what you write. There isn't just other academics, because we're great at talking to ourselves. That's something we're very skilled at. We're less good traditionally at talking to a broader public, and of course we're all publicly funded in some regard, and so we're actually we're supposed to be accountable to our public, and so we should talk to the public more. And there is an agenda about doing this, certainly in UK academia. In some other places around the world as well, but it's actually quite closely tied now in the UK to things like the development of your career and so on. It's a big part of what we're supposed to do. So actually, I think just the fact that you have engaged with it at all as a community is brilliant. I think Oscar's point about whether or not people are open to being involved in research if people are interested or if people do want to get involved, that is really helpful. But I can also understand that people might feel kind of uncomfortable with it, because ultimately it is opening a part of your life to scrutiny, and that is difficult. But yeah, so just really sort of taking it seriously, I think is great.
Well, I think in the case of Eve and getting people into groups in order to do the research, I don't think the difficulty you ran into there is so much people not wanting to open up that part of their lives, as just we're a bunch of paranoid bastards when it comes to spies. I mean, there's a webcomic, Control-Alt-Delete, that had a lot of fun when it was revealed that the NSA was using World of Warcraft to spy on people, and other MMOs, because they put up this whole comparison between how you get into a guild in WoW and how you get into a corporation in Eve, and at the end of it came out with the conclusion of, I think we understand why the NSA wasn't spying on anyone in Eve.
Yeah, that's funny. What is that? Is that the one where, you know, we take your pulse after you've been submerged in hot butter?
Yeah,
it was.
They actually put the guy through a full interrogation just to get in.
It's like any other MMOs is like, I like to shoot stuff and kill things. Oh, me too. You're in.
I like to stab things. We like to stab things too. You can join us.
Well, I think that also, given the platform that Eve is actually on, it seems to attract people that are more technically inclined, because it's not a particularly easy game to get into. There seems to be a disproportionate amount of people in the IT sphere, and also ex-military types as well. That seems to be quite prevalent, at least in the null-sec communities, not necessarily high-tech.
There's actually quite a high incidence of people in the armed forces being involved in the whole range of MMOs, which is something that's definitely worth looking into. I mean, I realise it's in the context, for example, of people just being stuck on bases and not really having much access to other things to do, but it is quite important, I think, because it shows their sort of significant role in the formation of these communities.
Well, I think that it definitely shows in certain parts. It's just like how people generally kind of order and conduct themselves. I mean, for the Imperium as a whole, I have to say that its IT services as a whole, put many organisations to shame, just completely to shame.
Well, come on, we are the CIA.
To be fair, I think in terms of military personnel, being part of MMOs, and I definitely have seen a lot of army personnel playing EVE Online. I think we kind of miss a little bit of. I think CCP's kind of missed a little bit of a kind of marketing strategy there as well, because if you're on a military base playing EVE Online in your downtime, at least you're not running around your military base with a running app that can be used to spy on where you all.
Oh, you went there.
Yeah, I went there.
I think we covered that on a different episode, you and I, McLeod, where I pointed out that CCP should really start trying to market directly to things like the military and educational institutions.
Yeah, I don't know whether we covered it specifically, but if people aren't aware, there was a recent sort of news article about particular running apps that are uncovering hidden military bases and CIA bases and stuff like that in other countries. Because
awesome.
It's just.
Have you done any guest lectures yet, Nick, about EVE?
I've done some talks about EVE at conferences, which is just part of the sort of the process often of producing these papers. So you often give a conference paper and then you write it up. I haven't given any more substantial, not like the stuff that Andrew Groen's done, for example. He's given some quite, large audience presentations. I haven't done any of that kind of stuff yet.
So we had a big pause there. I gotta ask, what the fuck's on McLeod's head? Did he take a mop apart?
We haven't had that word said enough in this show.
I don't know. I just got here 5 seconds ago. Why is McLeod wearing a mop?
I randomly wore some weird ass thing when me and Eric were doing some pre-set up show stuff, and Eric was just like, "You should wear that for the show." I was like, "Oh, all right, whatever."
Fucking cry. I'm glad I actually decided to get on here because I needed to see this and question the reasoning.
You know, I did enjoy Arendis. I don't know if you're being coy or not, but I think you were about a Goon Swarm being, you know, a CIA.
Well, no, I was actually referencing the whole mess with Glenn Beck, where like,
yep,
you know, because Sean told Alex gotta go gunfire on Jabber, we were suddenly the CIA.
Yeah, I remember that. And that's what I was bringing that up, right? Is that something perhaps that we may be the only one to have been accused publicly on live TV of being a CIA front?
I think so.
That was some serious tinfoil hatchery right there.
Oh my god!
And considering, you know, Eve players are pretty good at sort of, you know, pointing at things and saying that's quite tinfoily, and being quite paranoid about stuff.
I will give the man credit. When you want tinfoil, Glenn Beck goes there.
Dr. Nick, did you know that we had been accused by Glenn Beck of being a CIA friend?
Wait,
I did, yeah.
Well, I'm not aware of this. What?
Oh, okay. Not to dig into ancient history and reopen any old wounds for anybody who might be watching. But when the whole Benghazi thing went down, Vile Rat was on Jabber talking to Mittens.
Oh, okay. I know what we're talking about now.
Because we knew about it, in essence, before the State Department did.
Oh, okay. I got
yeah. So
I completely forgot that's how that situation went down, and I apologize if that brings up some old wounds for people. I just could not remember what we were discussing.
I think it's just an interesting historical fact, just truly within Goonswarm.
Well, it just illustrates how connected the world really is these days.
It does. It does. So so now that we have Scythe here, screaming and yelling like he normally does,
hey, fuck off.
It feels like a real show.
Hey, I tried to run over an entire mob of joggers, but the cops wouldn't let me. They blocked an entire city. Y'all don't even know.
This isn't Scythe.
This?
This isn't Scythe basically sort of admitting that he wants to sort of, you know, be a terrorist. And
no. This is
like,
Scythe got stuck in the middle of a city and surrounded on all four sides by detour roadblocks, and basically I just had to wait there for like half an hour before I could go to work this morning.
I'm gonna tell Mrs. Eric that you're mad at runners, and she's gonna be very.
I actually have to take off myself now, so I will catch you guys later.
Don't go jogging.
Take care.
Thank you for joining us, Ernest. I really appreciate you taking the time.
It was a lot of fun.
Dirk McGurk, did you know Hillary had an EVE Online in her home server?
Is that
that's where all the emails went?
Is that the Chinese server?
Yeah.
So what are we going to talk about now? I mean, we have really driven into this paper, which I think was fabulous, by the way, Dr. Nick.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
I would like to add that, like, as I hope that we see, or at least get like an inkling of other research papers and academic kind of stuff that goes on to do with Eve, because I think I kind of almost sorely missed some academia going on about Eve since Dr. Eno kind of left CCP as CCP's like financial analyst, I guess, like virtual world financial analyst, not like their actual company analyst.
I'm not biting your bait.
Oh, Caleb.
I do have a favour or two to ask, though, for the next paper that you actually write, particularly if you're going to use particular methods and techniques in order to actually kind of like do this, is to actually preface is like some of the methods that you actually did, because it's not necessarily evident in the paper that you did this time round about the different types of places that you actually collected information, and from what perspective you also actually try to do it. So, because when I read that kind of like paper, given the fact that obviously I went through all of that kind of like, war from within the Imperium as a whole, and also, with the name change and all of that sort of stuff, I think that it would have helped me kind of like rationalize what you'd actually written, because from my perspective, it did feel as if it missed the mark on more than one point, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think this comes back to that discussion we were having earlier, doesn't it, about who we spoke to or didn't speak to, and how we gathered the material together. I think no matter how hard we try, there will always be weaknesses in the work that we produce as academics, particularly in a space that's as complicated as this.
Yeah, well, it's like you're pressed for like, time, resources, and everything else. But I think that, as I say, within that kind of abstracting, that kind of like, preface side of things,
Sure.
if you can just like describe the methods and techniques that you actually use, because then from my perspective, when I'm actually reading it, then it gives the paper greater weight on the grounds that, you've validated why you've taken the approach that you've like taken, and therefore it like, the rest of it will make more sense to me thereafter.
Yeah, and it's a good point anyway about accessibility, because we're trying to make this work more accessible to more people, means including clearer explanations of what we're doing, for sure. So no, that's a good thing, a good bit of feedback, and I'll take that to heart for sure.
You're welcome, and if you want to kind of like talk at any point about the inner workings of at least my mind within the Imperium, which shouldn't take long, by all means feel free to give me a shout.
Thank you. I promise I'm not a spy. I'm not a spy for anybody, not the CIA or anyone.
I don't even care if you are, dear.
That's exactly what a spy would say.
Is it? Oh, I am a spy. Oh no, hang on.
See, we've caught him.
Let's
take him out.
When you've got
covers
over 35,000 players in your alliance, you got a spy or two in there somewhere, right?
I mean, we got a NASA guy. How hard would it be for us to actually have someone in the CIA?
And by the way,
go
ahead, McLeod.
I was just going to say, sort of just like to flesh out your point that you just made, like just a minute ago, that yeah, when it comes to sort of the larger organizations in EVE, yeah, we all operate under the assumption that there are a lot of spies around. So
yeah, and we all know the 35,000 translate to some amount smaller individuals, right? But when you sit there in conversations and you say, yeah, you can kind of make fun of the gameplay, but you realize that we're an organization of about 35,000 players, people go, what? When you think that in terms of social organizations, that's pretty large for gaming, right?
And actually that slide is really important in justifying the sort of validity of studies as well, because when you talk to academics about this and they're initially sniffy about it, and then you say, well, yeah, but you're talking about, as you say, 35,000 people or 350,000 players or something like that. That's the point at which they start to pay attention. When they realize,
numbers help.
Yeah, and I think they always have with games. I mean, one of the major arguments around games has been, for example, around GTA and the amount of money that's made, and the big numbers just impress people.
Yeah, GTA does have a lot of role play kind of stuff going on in it, like GTA Online.
It is now, yeah.
It's actually quite interesting how much.
Be like, oh, we're a biker gang and we go around and do so and so, or that kind of stuff is actually picking up. Really
even
fast.
like sort of, even the people going around like role playing as cops and sort of law enforcement and stuff. It's really kind of interesting.
But just to come back to the point you made, McLeod, about other academic work. There was a book that came out in 2016 called Internet Spaceships: A Serious Business, which was edited by the same people that edited the special issue of the journal that this article was in. And that's basically a mixture of academic and non-academic writing about EVE. I mean, it's got a piece in there from Cribber, for example, and I think something from Mittens, but it's also got a bunch of academic chapters as well. So there is some other stuff floating around.
I shall have to look at that then, definitely.
So
we should make it a recurring segment.
Voltels says there were probably 4 Nixes killed during this show. I would probably say there's probably been 4 Nixes and 15 Rorquals, but you know,
Yep, at least 30 excavator mining drones have died during the filming of this broadcast.
Been booshed away. The
and probably twice as many Nixes and like Rorquals have just come out of build as well.
Yeah, we had eight super carriers come out every 10 seconds. There's a joke about the Scottish comedians, like, every time I clap my hand, a child in Africa dies. Well, every time we clap our hands, a super is built.
There you go. One of the things I think would be interesting, and I don't know if either of you participated in this, Dr. Nick, but did you guys participate in any of the sort larger EVE meetups like EVEsterdam or FanFest or EVE Vegas? I think getting input from those or things from individual players would be amazing.
I haven't done. It is on my list of things that I would like to do. Again, funding is a thing. I don't know whether Oscar might have been to something like that. I'm not sure, but I certainly haven't been able to as yet.
Yeah. By the way, I'm going to interject. You know your name 5 put something in chat. He said, inverting the subject for a moment as well as food for thought. If there is so much talk going on in the media, why don't you think it doesn't fully break into the mainstream and continues to be niche? And I don't know if you're referring to that as EVE or you're referring to that as conversations about social constructs in online gaming. I'm not sure, so maybe he can expound on that.
I get the impression that maybe he thinks in terms of like EVE being quite a niche game versus being a mainstream game. I think half of that's down to the understanding of the game and understanding everything around the game. Like I'm not talking in terms of like, you know, all the various different kind of mechanics of the game, but like, you know, people's understanding of first person shooters is very, very easy. You know, you point somewhere, you fire a gun, the thing that it was pointed at dies, kind of thing. When it
EVE is not casual friendly, and that goes for the people that look at it as well, right? Most people I know will ask me about stuff in EVE, and I will tell them, and they will have a genuine interest in it, but they won't want to play it.
Yeah, because me and Caleb were actually talking about this before the show, about how EVE is one of those games where you kind of actually have to, you have to have a degree of knowledge about what's going on before you can really understand what you're seeing. In the same way that, like, if you're trying to, you know, talk about quantum physics to somebody who has no idea of what physics is, you kind of have to warm them up towards it by actually kind of explaining various fundamentals of physics first.
So it's really down to CCP, right? If they want to get a bigger segment into their game, they have to make some aspects of it more casual friendly, and they haven't.
Yeah. They have to find ways to sort of, you know, shortcut through. I don't know how.
I know how y'all play other games as well, and I tell my friends about EVE all the time, and they're like, "Well, how do I get into that?" I'm like, "Well, step 1, make a count, skill queue about 3 months worth of skills, specifically these, and then read all of this Wikipedia on how the game works, and then play 3 months later." It's
you know what?
Touch it now, you know.
You know what the issue there, Scythe, is the read all of this stuff.
Yeah, and that should be taught in game.
That
that's called a tutorial, and the tutorial for EVE sucks.
Well, I'm going to get some feedback from that on from Billy Buffington, our friend, on how he took the new player experience. One of the things I want to address is somebody said, you know, we're one of the most toxic environments out there for gaming. I disagree. I wholeheartedly disagree. Nowhere and in no game have I ever met my opposition in person and had drinks with them. Okay.
Yeah.
And McLeod, you'll agree with me. We have played a game that was far more toxic than this environment, right?
Yeah.
And
I had to cough.
I would be.
I think the argument is actually the exact opposite. It's the harshest community when you're playing them, but it's the most friendly when you're not.
It's one of those things where everyone who plays to some degree is very tribalistic to their own kind of group. But it's almost like, because the type of people who play are generally, you know, more mature. We're more mature when it comes to actually, you know, talking about things face to face. You know, and you know, talking about the game face to face is just one of those things. Like we may say stuff to each other in local that may seem very toxic, but it's very much, except for one or two exceptions, which really kind of sully the name of Eve to some degree. When it comes to out of game kind of stuff, we generally tend to be quite civil.
Yeah, with the exception of maybe Sarah. I might pull the trapdoor lever on him, but by and large, there are very few people who, you know, in Eve, it's almost like, hey, you play Eve, like you're a click of gaming, like it's like a secret society of Eve, right?
It's what's the starting race you picked, and if they don't know one immediately, you know they're a chump. Don't play with that guy; he's not cool. Because I would say the first time I ever got on the airplane, I sat by a bunch of my enemies in Eve, and we then started playing Super Smash Brothers, like on some guy's like Switch or whatever. Like it immediately devolved into, oh yeah, let's do this thing, and we had a good time, and it was awesome. You know, it was a great experience to meet your enemy in person and realize, oh, we're actually going to just be more entertained because we're going to insult each other like jokingly and then drink beer.
I think the other thing, though, is that even though it has mainstream breakthrough, that mainstream media article always seems to come with some kind of caveat about the game being notoriously complicated. And, you know, that in and of itself for a lot of people is off-putting, isn't it?
Yeah, and I come from the perspective that Eve is a complex game. It's not a complicated game. And you guys can argue with me till you're red in the face, right? I think that if Eve is played as it's supposed to be played, generally not as an individual, but as a group, the group brings up the new and trains the new and shows them the way of the ropes, very much like life does. And I think if you play the game in that manner, you're going to love the game.
Yeah, and well, you know, the bit that I have a problem with there is how many different ships are there, Eric?
There's too many.
Okay, how many different training skills are there?
There's too many.
How many different modules are there?
There's too many. And because I say that, right, that is where the community of the game gives you the distinct advantage, right? And I'll use Zarker as an example, one of the guys who's sometimes with us here and we've played H1Z1 with and other things. He played Eve, he quit. He played H1Z1, somehow he hooked up with a bunch of goons, some of them here, and then he said, hey, I'm going to play Eve because you all play Eve. And then he comes and plays Eve. He's like, holy shit, this is a different game. This is so easy to play now.
And he progresses faster than me. He was in capital. He was flying. He had more capitals in a shorter space of time than I did over like 5 times the length of time. It's ridiculous.
Because Zarker's the ultimate min-maxer by nature, right? And then if you give him a few simple guidelines, right, like Goon forums and talking to people who play the game for a decade, he just excels and he loves it. And that's how you play Eve. And if you don't play Eve that way, then if you're not a social animal in gaming, Eve's not the game for you, in my opinion. If you're a social animal, you're gonna be great.
Well, they have always, you know, there have been many people who have said that Eve is less of a game, more of a social simulator. So
it absolutely is, which is why I find it perfect for this research paper, right? And why we're talking about it too. I mean, there is nothing non-social. I mean, I will tell you, McLeod, I would never have watched the returns on the British elections if you and Matterall hadn't invited me to a chat. I think we were even on Twitch live talking about it. I learned so much, right? And that's the interesting social aspect of this.
Does that mean you're going to join us watching Eurovision when it starts?
No.
Oh my god!
What are we, some kind of communist?
Yeah, no.
We will watch the Great British Bake Off with you, though. That is required.
Hold it. There's a Great British Bake Off?
Dude, it's fucking awesome.
Oh, we have to watch this on Twitch.
Every year, it's good.
See, we're making actual social plans because we have all played this stupid game called Eve.
Now we're gonna watch
And
a
somehow
baking
we
show
got
about
hooked
British
up on this
comedians we've
show
never heard of.
through common friends.
I would like to say, Dirk, like, you may think fuck no Eurovision, but in actual fact it's hilarious, especially if you watch it with people who don't even understand what Eurovision is. Like trying to explain, even just trying to explain it to them, like people lose their minds with it. But it's just hilarious to watch.
I think you explained Eurovision to me, McLeod, and I giggled at it the entire time you were telling me what the fuck
it was
are you
just
talking
like,
about. This is stupid.
The fact that there's so much politics in it as well. I was just like, why is there politics in this?
Whatever. It's like,
well, I just like the fact that you can show off stuff like Conchita Wurst, and Matterall would just have an ooh face for hours.
Yeah.
When is this Bake Off thing? I want to be there. We got to have a show.
Didn't it just finish the season?
There's various different seasons. Yeah, there's loads of seasons for it already.
yeah, dude. It's like one every year.
Or we can watch, reruns of actual, Japanese, like Iron Chef or whatever.
Why don't we just go and watch Stargate and then get back to you? I think that's it's on Amazon Prime again.
I think the last thing that we kind of covered as a community was when we were doing the German election, wasn't it, Matt?
It was Brexit.
To be honest,
Was it Brexit?
I
thought we did a huge set of shows making fun of Brexit.
I think I think there was a little community thing where like we were just watching sort of the Brexit thing, maybe, but that's about it. But I don't know. I definitely want to do Eurovision. That'd be fucking awesome. It'd be a fun show.
I think we should have a show on the review of the Olympics opening ceremonies.
Who's doing it this year? I don't even know where the Olympics is at. That's how bad I am.
South Korea.
Like, more importantly, aren't we going to get kicked out of Eurovision?
Yeah, are the Brits allowed to compete anymore? They're no longer Europe.
We don't have to pay for it, but then again, Australia's in it, so Australia's obviously a legitimate. Australia's a legitimate part of. Australia's a legitimate part of Europe.
Is like Eurovision your attempt at 500 channels and nothing's on? Like
No. It's like American Idol, but other countries, all at once.
It's like American Idol, but state-sponsored kind of act.
Yeah. It's this is the Olympics of American Idol. Like that's the only way I can say it.
Is that where all those
with all the
YouTube
politics
videos?
that come with state sponsorship?
Oh, is this where all the YouTube videos of people doing pole dancing come from?
Nah, the interesting part is when you have to start explaining block voting in Eurovision. It's hilarious. But again, in Eve circles, it's very easy to understand.
I didn't know about the block voting. All I know is there's fucking weird people on TV doing crazy shit.
Oh, you get an Estonian song on, and Lithuania. All of the Russian bloc will start voting them up, and the same when there's a Scandinavian song. It's hilarious.
You see, at some point, someone did something really edgy and really kind of weird and crazy in Eurovision, and for some reason, they got a whole bunch of points from it. And so there's been this constant sort of this constant thing in Eurovision where every so often not every so often, pretty much every year, you'd get a few really eccentric acts, like super eccentric acts, that just kind of make you go, okay.
As opposed to the Olympics, the Olympics is always like serious politics. In the Eurovision, it's always like camp politics.
Yeah, but you say that. I reckon if you were to do like political analysis on the scoring of Eurovision over the years, you would be able to work out what countries had good relationships with others.
I'm sure that's been done. I would be surprised if that's not actually been done.
But the other thing that I like about the eccentric acts as well is it does give rise to potential areas where where people break down social barriers as well. Like and that's in that kind of sense, that happened with like Conchita Wurst as well, that Caleb said. That was an act that people were not expecting, wasn't the norm, but he ended up winning. So
Isn't there some strange European show where two people go in a tent and have sex and they didn't know each other and then they talk about it afterwards?
I saw a trailer for that. What is this, McLeod? Explain it.
Is that Eurovision or is that?
That is Eurovision.
Or is that Scandinavian Vision? I don't
know. No. That's like Naked and Afraid, but European style.
That's something completely different.
It's a Scotsman on a horse.
A Scotsman on a horse.
It's very European.
You know, how does that not hurt?
It could be Love Island. No, it's not Love Island. It's not a Love Island.
I think it's called Pitch in a Tent or something like that. It's got some fucking weird name. I've seen this thing. I know what you're talking about, Eric.
Pitching in a tent.
I haven't seen it, so you know.
You're not trying hard enough.
It must be one of those. Must be one of those like, oh, I've taken a trip down, you know, through random YouTube videos and ended up in a place where I'm watching some.
I know. I want to watch the
TV show from Europe.
The thing with Jimmy Carr, where it's like the quiz of the year or whatever. What's it called? The Big Fat Quiz. And it was like a commercial in the middle of that. And I don't remember what it was called, but it's like some lady. She's like, it's like two people are going to go into this room and then have sex, and when they come out, we're going to talk about it with them.
Well, there was something on the news
and I was like, what?
Because they were talking about bringing that show to the U.S. like a year or two ago, and then
exactly.
Yeah, I think very vaguely recall that when you said some stuff about Big Fat was the year.
Yeah, I swear I saw that trailer. I don't know if that was like, because I don't understand how the airing of Big Fat Quiz of the Year goes, but I thought that might have been like a joke commercial that like they put those in when they do the show because it's pretty funny.
Sometimes. I think they have done it sometimes, a few times before. But either way, that's some pretty ballsy network decision.
Yeah, it would be.
So, do you chaps have any other Eve-related kind of shit this week, or are you just going to talk about?
Is it safe to mine and delve yet?
No. In fact, I was going to say here.
We do all of it, dude. All right.
It's always safe to mine and delve.
No. There's one man who can give me his opinion on if it's safe to mine and delve, and that's when I know.
That would be total newbie, wouldn't it?
That would be total newbie if y'all haven't met.
We're not a
basically
in our corporation.
Say something and then go hunt scythe.
Yeah, true. So yeah, we're pretty much exhausted everything today. I'm gonna wrap it, but I'm gonna give first I want to thank Dr. Nick. Thank you for joining us and sharing your work with us and some of your thoughts on the matter. We really
thank you for having
appreciate it. And of course, this will be recorded on INN News. If you don't have that link, I'll drop it in the chat too, because it'll be available right after this show. You know, and thank you, Caleb and Scythe and everything. Scythe, thank you for not killing any joggers. My wife is.
She wasn't here, so I know it'd be fine.
I know. And you know, I'm gonna give Dr. Nick. We're gonna give you the last word, but I'm gonna go around a table here and say, Caleb, you got anything for today?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the coverage on the Meta Show today to see if something's actually happened this week.
Oh, and we got a new follower, new fingerprint.
What do you mean something happened? It's like the MER got released, didn't it?
Yeah, and it was boring. So.
What do you mean? It's like boring by look who won again, yeah?
Exactly. It's pretty much another one and another one, and we've had them for what 6 months now. So I'm getting a little bit bored about the MER, to be honest.
MERs are basically now a victory lap for goons.
Pretty much.
Just like advertising, like for recruitment.
Yeah, and Dr. Nick.
Quite obviously, we lost the Casino War, or World War B, if you prefer.
Yeah,
we
for
are
Dr.
a
Nick,
shadow of our former selves.
The MER that we're talking about is the.
We are in a cultural crisis.
Here's the deal: if everyone just assimilates to goons, we all get Titans, and then we can just gate camp each other with Titans.
So by the way, my Discord finally stopped working with voice, so you guys didn't hear me. Just for Dr. Nick, the MER is the monthly economic report out of Eve. If you don't know what that is.
All right, yeah, I have seen it, but I wouldn't have made the association.
Oh, and it pretty much says goons win, goons win, goons win. And and McLeod, what do you got for the end of the show?
I mean, to be completely honest, I just wanted to shout out to my initiative bros and my fellow T-grad corpmates.
I thought you were going to give a shout out to your hairstylist. That's pretty good.
No. This came from China.
Mr. Moomin, going to you.
Well, I would. I'd like to thank my mother, my father. It's sort of like my primary school teachers.
Play him out. Play him out.
No, I really don't have a great deal to kind of like add, but thank you as for like having me on and putting up with me for a little bit, really. So have a nice one, chaps, and speak soon.
It's always a pleasure, Moomin. Thank you for joining us. Scythe, you got anything?
Yeah. Tomorrow, Americans are going to do one or two of their favorite things. A, root for the Patriots, or B, root against the Patriots. That's just how it works.
Only 17% of America is rooting for the Patriots.
I know. They're going to do one of their two favorite things.
The Steelers could have beat the Patriots the way they played in that last game, and it could have been an all-Pennsylvania fucking Super Bowl and been awesome. So I'm going to say fly, Eagles, fly.
Yeah, there you go. Throw that sports and egg real good.
There you go. And I'm going to get a shout-out to myself because, I wrote an article on the MER, or as I like to call it, the Mir spacecraft.
As you like to call the Goon blog.
But there was one interesting thing. I actually calculated the year-over-year rate of inflation, and it is a little bit high. So it'll be interesting in the article. All right. So with that, we're going to say goodbye. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Thank you for all the follows and all the subs. We do appreciate it. We appreciate all the chatter in the chat because it really helps us drive the show, and we do appreciate all the participation. So thank you very much. You're a great audience, and we will see you next week. Thank you, everyone.